Story 1. When I was a first-year student in college in 1966, I took my first programming course. We wrote programs on punch cards. Each card was a line of code. It seemed pretty cool at the time. Story 2. I'm gonna brag here. We took a field trip to the North American Aerospace Defense Command Complex in Cheyenne Mountain. We rode a trolley into the mountain, sat in a conference room, and watched a video about what happened there. Then we rode the trolley back to the parking lot, ate our packed lunches, and drove back to school. Story 3. The PlayStation Portable, when it first came out, was gorgeous. It still is, even by today's design standards. Story 4. A huge mechanical analog computer called a differential analyzer at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration in the late 1960s. Story 5. Back in the late 1980s, my dad's workplace had a three-dimensional printer. It was a multi-million-dollar machine. The resin was toxic before curing, and it took an entire shift to print a 10-inch square part. This was rapid prototyping at a large car company. Story 6. I was a science nerd in high school. My Christmas gift in 1972 or 1973 was one of the earliest Texas Instruments calculators. Story 7. When the first full touchscreen phones came out, they were pretty mind-blowing. Bluetooth was also pretty wild. Story 8. Boomer here. I remember the first car I saw with a frequency modulation radio. It used a signal converter mounted under the dash, but the sound came through the single amplitude modulation speaker. I recall the first radial tires. They always looked half flat. 8-track tapes, cassette tapes, compact discs, Walkman players. Mobile phones the size of a brick. Then smartphones with a camera and internet access. I paid $1,800 for my first personal computer with a printer. It had 100 megabytes of hard disk drive space. The display said more memory than you will ever use in a lifetime. It had a dot matrix printer and a 1200 baud modem, which was the latest thing. Bulletin board systems were our communication then, with forums and a few games. Story 9. I saw three-dimensional printers at Maker Faire events and at university science, technology, engineering, and mathematics conventions. I printed some small blue MakerBot models, a small orange castle, and a ratcheting socket wrench. 10 years later, I have two three-dimensional printers. They are much faster and easier to use than they used to be, and the technology has come a long way. Its popularity has grown in the past 5 to 7 years. Story 10. My dad builds parts for cars, but I remember him owning a machine that could carve small objects from metal using a blueprint. He made a few chess pieces, a small mermaid statue, a dog, and a few other small pieces. I have no idea what that machine was called. I want to ask him now. Story 11. In the mid-1980s, my dad bought the family an Apple IIe computer, a modem, and a subscription to CompuServe. The internet existed, but the general public did not have access to it. CompuServe was a private network of servers. You would dial in to a local node and it would provide its services. I read the manual that came with it and my mind was blown. I could send messages to other people who used the service, no matter where they were, and play games with people across the globe as long as they were also on CompuServe. A few years later, I got internet access at college and then saw the World Wide Web start up. Discovering that level of connectivity was incredible. Story 12. As a Generation Z person, I was shocked at how record players worked. I really did not understand them. I thought they were much more futuristic than compact discs and digital audio files. Story 13. My dad worked on the cloud for the military about 10 years before it was available for public use. The original concept was a small light blue box. I was flabbergasted by the idea. My dad was a systems architect. He could see how things worked before he made them. He was a brilliant man, and his loss 15 years ago was devastating. Story 14. In the mid-1960s, I was in my mid-teens and saw a ruby laser rod, heard an explanation of how it worked, and watched a demonstration of the entire system. Story 15. Automatic power car windows. From birth until I was about 6, my parents drove old, well-maintained cars that did not have power windows but the old-school crank. When I got into my dad's friend's car and he had electric windows, my little mind was blown. I was convinced we were only a few years away from flying cars, living on the moon, and miniature pet dinosaurs when I saw them. That was back in the 1990s. Story 16. When I was a little kid, we went on a field trip to the local dairy to see how our school got its milk for the cafeteria. We waded through mud and cow manure all day. They also had sheep because they had finished lambing the day before. There was a bloody pile of decapitated lamb heads next to the barn. The next year, the school district switched to Carnation Dairy because the other place was so nasty. You have to love country life. Story 17. My dad worked with computers for the Navy. I remember him taking me to a room full of refrigerator-sized cabinets with large reels of magnetic tape spinning on them. They were covered with blinking lights, dials, and buttons, like in science fiction. It was so cold there that we had to wear parkas and so loud we needed ear protection. Then we went into a room that was a mock-up of the flight control center of an aircraft carrier. There were large glass panels and sailors stood behind them and wrote backwards so it could be read from the front. I thought it looked like the control center scenes from Star Wars. This was probably around 1985. Story 18. This may not fit the brief, but for me it was air conditioning in a car. Story 19. Those flip-up BlackBerry phones with touchscreens were crazy. Story 20. A Panasonic video home system player and recorder paused recording during advertisements. It included a laser barcode reader because television guides printed barcodes with the recording time. Scanning a barcode sent the schedule to the recorder. Story 21. I remember seeing the Segway announced on Good Morning America on my parents' bedroom television on my birthday in 2001. To an 11-year-old, that was extremely cool. Story 22. A tiny palm-top computer from Japan. The screen looked terrible. It had a tragically slow central processing unit even for the time and barely any memory. An auxiliary battery pack almost doubled the unit size and brought the price to $4,000. But it truly looked like the future. Story 23. Portable televisions like the little 3 to 4-inch handheld sets you could get, such as Sony Watchman models and so on, were astonishing. I remember thinking how cool it was that they could miniaturize the hardware of a television to such a degree. It felt very futuristic. Story 24. The very first video game I ever saw was not a commercial product but a lab experiment exhibited by the engineering department of the University of Texas at an open house in the early 1970s. It was crude even by Pong standards, but the line to play was huge. Story 25. My dad worked for Texas Instruments and brought home an early calculator. I remember it being the size of a shoebox, though I assume that is wrong. Story 26. I saw the first laser video discs at a demonstration when I was a child in the late 1970s. They were the size of long-playing records, not digital versatile discs or Blu-ray discs, and could only play about half an hour per side. The picture quality was amazing, especially compared with the picture from a standard over-the-air broadcast received with rabbit ear antennas. Story 27. I remember walking through Sears with my dad and seeing the first consumer 4-function calculator. Story 28. My father worked in radar for the Royal Canadian Air Force, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, and was seconded to the United States Air Force Strategic Air Command. I saw light pens, trackballs, 5-foot-tall klystron tubes, and all sorts of interesting equipment. I have seen things you would not believe. A Tupolev Bear aircraft 12 miles off the coast of California. I watched sweep beams glitter in the dark inside the operations center. All those moments will be lost in time like most of the things from the 1960s. Story 29. I share this story with young people to illustrate how much technology has advanced in the last few decades. This is not my story. It comes from an attorney I worked with for years. He said when his law firm acquired its first facsimile machine, everyone stood around and watched the thermal paper unroll. He admitted to getting a tear in his eye and thinking, I wish my father could have lived to see this. Story 30. When I was a child, we were still launching rockets to the moon, and I remember drawing rockets with my crayons that had the words United States of America written on them. Story 31. Butler in a box. A cool home control system far ahead of its time. Story 32. One of my core memories is of sitting in a Fazoli's restaurant, reading a personal computer magazine article about the first 400 MHz processors, and feeling absolutely fascinated. Story 33. I remember seeing the iPod for the first time at Circuit City, and my mind was blown. Story 34. My dad borrowed a friend's Pong console and we played for hours. 10 years later, he brought a teletype machine home from work. It had a modem that required placing the telephone handset into the machine. We then dialed a number someone had given him. I think it was a Chicago area code, and we played Colossal Cave Adventure all night. Hint: sometimes you cannot get back from where you have gone just by reversing course. Story 35. This is the mock-up of the space shuttle at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration from when I was a Brownie Scout. I wanted to fly to space too. Story 36. Those pens have 4 different ink colors and represent peak technology. Story 37. A keyboard input monitor 1 microcomputer. Story 38. When I was a kid, we went to Epcot in Orlando, not long after it opened in 1982. We went to a video telephone kiosk to make reservations for dinner. It blew my mind that we were talking on the telephone with a person we could see. Story 39. When I saw an advertisement for the Atari 2600, I was amazed that wealthy people could play Space Invaders at home. Is this the year 2000? Story 40. The Vectrex was the first truly arcade-quality console. It was released in October 1982. It was a commercial failure, but the technology was mind-blowing for the time. A video demonstrates what the Vectrex was capable of. Story 41. Books on compact disc were amazing. That is how I learned to read. Story 42. In 1992, my cousin brought one of his computers over and showed me how to play video games on it, such as Star Control 2. Story 43. I remember the Arcos 5 tablet coming out. It felt like a massive jump in technology at the time. Story 44. The graphical leap from the PlayStation 1 to the PlayStation 2 is still unmatched. Gran Turismo 2 and 3 were absolutely unreal. An underrated gem from that console generation was Sonic Adventure on the Dreamcast, a machine ahead of its time. The Dreamcast paved the way for the PlayStation 2 and Xbox. Story 45. This is one of the early Burroughs mainframe computers from the mid-1960s. My mother was a key punch operator. We took a tour of her workplace when I was a child. Story 46. The global positioning system changed road trips. Instead of bringing physical maps and navigating on the fly, people now type in address and are guided there. It revolutionized both domestic and international travel, but it is often taken for granted. Story 47. These robots. When I was little, I was so flabbergasted. Story 48. I still own a Sega Genesis and play Sonic the Hedgehog every once in a while. Story 49. In our game room in my grandparents' basement, we had an early mechanical version of Pong. It was the size of an old television with a translucent screen. Inside, an arm with a light at the end moved from one side of the screen to the other. Story 50. When we got cable with a remote, we didn't have to get up to change channels anymore. Story 51. I was 8 years old when we got our first Betamax video cassette recorder. We were watching movies at home, and my young mind was blown. I am now 50 years old. Story 52. When my dad took our International Business Machines 486 personal computer to a friend's house to fix a booting problem, I heard a sound card for the very first time. It was just beeps and boops coming from the small microphone on the motherboard. That was mind-blowing. Story 53. I saw a computer for the first time in the early 1970s. It blew my mind and set the course for my career. Story 54. My cousin had a portable compact disc player when he came to visit. He let me listen to a compact disc by Limp Bizkit, and then I asked him if I had to rewind it when I was finished. Story 55. As a child, I would say simple calculators. I learned to use a slide rule and logarithm tables, but calculators performed some tasks faster. Story 56. It is no big deal today, but to me the first handheld Texas Instruments calculator in 1969 was remarkable. It was large and performed only basic math functions, yet it represented an incredible step forward. No more slide rule calculations. Story 57. I remember when the original Nintendo Entertainment System came out. I had tried Atari games a few times and played arcade games at the local convenience store, but seeing Super Mario Bros. In action mesmerized me. I remember my friend playing it in his basement when I came over, and after watching and trying to play for a couple of hours, I ran home to tell my mother I was controlling the television. It was amazing. I received one that Christmas. Story 58. A calculator the size of a credit card and almost as thin became popular. Bigger handheld calculators had only recently become cheap, and skinny solar-powered calculators were the next cool thing. The Walkman and similar pocket-sized tape players were popular. Story 59. A fucking tank. I was about 6 or 7. It was during the Gulf War. They had it stationed in the village on St. Simon's Island to guard the port of Brunswick, and they let the children explore the interior. It was pretty dope. I remember all the screens were black with green text. Story 60. Plasma flat-screen televisions. I first encountered them at the mall above a central kiosk, and I wanted one. They cost about $20,000, though. Story 61. I got to operate the elevator at the nursing home on my paper route. Simpler times. Story 62. In my late teens, when I was visiting prospective colleges, I saw a Prius shipped from Japan before they were sold in the United States. It was being tested by the engineering department, and I thought the technology was so cool. Story 63. I remember being gobsmacked the very first time I heard frequency modulation radio. It may not have been considered cool technology, but to a young child it was magical. I was laughing out loud. Story 64. I had never been more excited in my life when my dad first bought me a GameCube. I could not believe it. Story 65. This LG Electronics monitor has a circular red light on its base. It is from the early 2010s. I cannot remember the model. Story 66. The World's Fair in New York City had so many exciting new things. I got to go twice. The General Electric building was amazing. Video cameras with playback were brand new, as were computers and futuristic cars. Story 67. The PlayStation 1 changed everything. The Sega Dreamcast was better in my opinion, but it did not have as many games. Story 68. It legitimately blew my mind 20 years ago when the first automatic paper towel dispensers were installed in bathrooms. It was so cool. Story 69. Probably when my friend's dad asked me to pull his finger. Story 70. I first saw the World Wide Web when my father loaded a page in Netscape in 1995. Story 71. A wealthy friend's family showed me a video cassette recorder for the first time. It seemed like magic. You could play back recordings on your television. Story 72. My father worked at Texas Instruments, and I remember him bringing home one of the first handheld calculators they produced. A friend whose father also worked for Texas Instruments told me a story. She walked into the house and found her father in his recliner with a board across the arms, his slide rule, the new calculator, and a notepad. He was furiously pushing buttons on the calculator, then picking up the slide rule to write notes. She asked what he was doing, and he said he was just checking to make sure the calculator was right. Story 73. That stupid recorder thing Macaulay Culkin has in Home Alone 2. Story 74. The earliest piece of cool tech I remember seeing as a kid that I wanted so badly was a portable computer that ran BASIC, the beginner's all-purpose symbolic instruction code, around 1993. The device was a clamshell-style gadget about the size of a modern smartphone and had a 36 by 64 dot matrix liquid crystal display, if I recall correctly. Samsung Fold-style phones remind me a lot of that portable computer. I never got one, but my dad did get me a similar device that was more of a digital Rolodex I could use as an address book and for notes. I have no idea what happened to it. Story 75. My first color TV was pretty great. I was 8 or 9 years old. Sitting close, I remember even the static was beautiful. Story 76. A color television from the late 1950s or the early 1960s. The color was not great, but it was amazing to watch. Story 77. When I was 7 years old, our neighbor invited us to his home to watch his television. It had a 9-inch screen, and we watched Queen Elizabeth's wedding in November 1947. Story 78. There was a screensaver for Macs around 1993. It ran on one of those newfangled computers in a social studies classroom. It cycled through animated images, such as a woman smoking and a man stranded on an island. I knew I had to learn how it worked. Now I am a senior developer. I thought the screensaver was pretty cool. Story 79. a Minix camera, a compact portable computer known as a luggable. Both are old. Story 80. My Nintendo did not even know what it was when we got it in 1989. Took us half the day to hook it up and find the game slot. When we started the game, we did not know how to use the controllers. By the end of the day, when we figured it out, we played Mario for a week straight, hardly eating or sleeping. We were blown away. Story 81. It still blows my mind that over-the-air television works. I understand it in theory, but how are sound and light transferred through the air to millions of people? And how does that tiny device we call a television convert those waves into moving pictures? Story 82. As a teenager, I got a PlayStation 2 for Christmas, popped in Final Fantasy V for the first time, and heard characters speak. It was the first time I heard actual verbal dialogue in a game, and I was totally mind-blown. Story 83. The first generation iMacs had see-through brightly colored monitors with the computer built in. They were the coolest. Story 84. A 5 megabyte Apple Profile hard drive. My dad bought an Apple Lisa package that came with one. In 1982, it was hilariously big for a personal computer. Story 85. I tried virtual reality at a kiosk in a mall around 1995. Cost $25. An attendant clipped sensors onto me and gave me a head-mounted display. I stepped onto a platform to keep from going out of bounds. It was an amazing experience. I thought all video games would be virtual reality within 10 years. Now, 30 years later, I am still waiting for it to meet my expectations. Story 86. I got a transistor radio in 1959. We lived on the side of a mountain and had no television reception, but that radio was my best friend. I listened to Elvis, Ricky Nelson, Jackie Wilson, and Johnny Horton. Bet you're jealous? Story 87. In the mid-1990s, I applied to a science and technology magnet high school. During the tour, they showed us a rapid prototyping machine that carved small objects from resin, an early industrial-grade version of a three-dimensional printer. It is surprising that these machines are now available to the general public for a few $100s. Story 88. A Motorola Razr in a rare dark blue version. A family friend had it and complained they could not use it because of their phone company, so they had no use for it. I convinced my father to buy it from her because, Jesus Christ, it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Even today, nothing compares to the sheer awe I felt when seeing and holding it. Story 89. Not necessarily the coolest, though maybe. I remember the first time I saw an electric typewriter. Before that, anyone who typed had to use manual typewriters because they were the only devices available. When International Business Machines introduced the Selectric with correction tape, I thought we had reached the height of technology. Story 90. The pistol you use in the Duck Hunt game on Nintendo devices. Story 91. A Macintosh computer with a small black and white screen. Story 92. When I was a kid, we had an Amana Radarange microwave oven. We kept a glass of water in it as recommended, in case you forgot and tried to preheat it. I also remember the first video games as opposed to pinball machines in arcades. Who else rented video home system tapes from Blockbuster and recorded them onto Betamax tapes? I guess I was a pirate before Napster. Story 93. A cordless television remote control. Then a microwave. Wow. What will they think of next? Story 94. Used to go to the Thomson-Ramo-Wooldridge electronic swap meet with my grandfather when I was a kid in the late 1980s and early 1990s. One time there was a guy selling laser tubes. They were about the size of a large flashlight and required a ridiculous amount of voltage and wattage to operate. He had them hooked up to a bank of batteries and transformers. They cost several $100s at the time. It was the coolest thing I had ever seen. Now they fit on a keychain and operate on a watch battery. Pretty amazing. Story 95. I'll never forget the TRS-80, the Tandy Radio Shack Model 80. I would spend hours in the local Radio Shack teaching myself to code. My family owned a restaurant in the same shopping center, and the manager was very cool and did not mind at all because I did not touch anything and knew to get out of the way if a customer came within 10 feet of me. Story 96. My mother bought a portable record player. I had never seen a record before that. We got Davy Crockett, a 45 record, and played it repeatedly. Story 97. I thought it was cool to control this blue spiky creature on the television screen when I was 7 years old. Story 98. Seeing and playing a three-dimensional video game for the first time was the most mind-blowing experience of my life. Story 99. My dad introduced me to Heathkit. I built a radio, then a metal detector and an early four-function calculator. Story 100. There was a very cool audio-video store in town, and I remember the first Walkman being on display. It blew my mind. Story 101. I did not have one, but I thought the Sidekick was going to be the cell phone of the future. Story 102. I wanted an amplitude modulation and frequency modulation radio headset so badly for Christmas. My grandparents bought me a boombox with a headset because they did not know what I wanted. I was very sad. Story 103. Vacuum tube amplitude modulation radios operate on several hundred volts, with glowing tubes trying to pick up radio stations hundreds of miles away. 01A vacuum tubes. Story 104. An Olympus jet engine, as used on the Concorde, mounted under the wing of a Royal Air Force Vulcan bomber while being tested for Rolls-Royce. Story 105. The Motorola Razr, the Sidekick, and the first iPhone were incredible. Story 106. The Shetley and Moody Mobile was in a mall in Daytona Beach around 1979. It was claimed to get almost 100 miles per gallon. Does anyone else remember that? Story 107. The Nintendo 64. Someone imported one from Japan and displayed it at a local computer swap meet. I was 10 at the time, and seeing Mario run around in three-dimensional space was mind-blowing. When a kid in my class got an Australian Nintendo 64, I was beyond jealous. Story 108. The Game Boy. I did not get my own until 1991, but I knew several other kids who were early adopters. It was a massive improvement over those terrible Tiger Electronics handhelds. The Game Boy felt like the real deal, assuming it was played in proper lighting. Story 109. This reminds me of a picture I have of my grandfather, who visited us in the United States in 1987 from Romania. He took photos of himself holding a remote control so he could show them to people back home. Story 110. This is a touchscreen computer from 2005 to 2006. I think my dad got access to it through work and brought it home for us to see. Story 111. In 1977, my math teacher was teaching us how to use logarithm tables and slide rules. My mother and father gave me a new Casio scientific calculator, one of the first models they made. I took it to school and showed my teacher. Her comment was, "Well, that makes most of what I am teaching you now useless." Story 112. Around age 5, I was semi-awakened by a sonic boom when the space shuttle landed at Edwards Air Force Base. Around age 25, a couple of sonic booms awakened me. I looked east and saw a small glow on the horizon as the space shuttle streaked downward toward Edwards. Story 113. The version 2 PlayStation 1 had a portable flip-up screen. It was a feat of radical engineering to my 12-year-old mind. I loved that little screen. It was one of the best Christmas gifts I ever received. Story 114. This is a 2003 Sony MZ G750 mini disc player. I got one when I was about 10 or 11. My friends made fun of me because MPEG Audio Layer 3 had just been introduced. Having a bunch of albums burned onto floppy disk-style mini discs to take with me was very cool. Story 115. A typewriter fascinated me. I am in my 20s, but those machines mystified me as a child. My mother had an old one from her college days and she let me keep it. I would type nonsense on it before I could even write. Story 116. Not when I was a kid, but my first Universal Serial Bus flash drive, 128 megabytes, had a physical switch that made it read-only. It was a cool thing to show friends and reduced the risk of getting a virus when connecting to someone else's computer. A downside was that if antivirus software detected a virus, it could not quarantine the file while it remained read-only. Story 117. When my mom got an iPod Touch for the first time, it was probably a second or third generation model. She let me try the earbuds and my mind was blown. The sound was so immersive, like it was coming from all around me. It was a bizarre experience the first time. I was at most 6 years old. I think it was a Black Eyed Peas track. I still use earbuds almost every day. Story 118. Nothing impressed me as a child because I did not know how anything worked. As a young adult, the iPod changed everything. Story 119. My aunt and uncle got a video recorder. They asked if I wanted to watch a film inside. Yes, it started in color and then it had sound too. It was amazing. Story 120. The Walkman with a full-blown music player in your pocket just blew my mind. Story 121. I remember being particularly taken aback by the Sega Dreamcast. The graphics and the little beeps and boops made it seem 10 to 20 years into the future, at least. Story 122. An operating system that did not show the blue screen of death or freeze all the time was rare. That does not happen often today unless you are running new software or a new driver, but in the early 2000s it was a huge issue. I am starting to see these problems more frequently recently. I wonder whether programming practices and attention to hardware detail are declining in reliability. Story 123. I remember my dad bringing his flight helmet and night vision goggles home once. It was pretty cool as a young kid in the mid-1990s to put them on and look around outside in the dark. Story 124. The world's first usable touchscreen was loaned to my country's Science Expo Center when I was there. It must have been around 2003. It was attached to a personal computer running Windows 2000. The system was mostly useless, but the touchscreen worked fine. Story 125. The Image Maximum Theater at the planetarium might not seem that crazy nowadays, but in the early 2000s, as a kid, that really blew my mind. Story 126. A student at my school had one of the earliest digital watches. The display was too power-hungry to run continuously, so you had to press a button to illuminate it. Story 127. I would say mid-90s full-body virtual reality. My memory has badly suffered with time, and I learned enough to intuit the secrets behind the curtain that made it work and that it would only work for a few specific games. Story 128. In 1984, my dad brought home an Apple Macintosh from work for a couple of weeks. He barely got to use it because I was glued to it the whole time. Even though it only had the built-in software, I used MacPaint nonstop. My father worked for a defense contractor, and they had an open house once where we got to tour the facility. Watching a color plotter in action and playing Colossal Cave Adventure on a dumb terminal are probably part of why I now work in information technology and have a three-dimensional printer. In high school, a friend of mine volunteered at the local science museum and got to bring home a laser for a couple of days. It was a beast. Roughly 3 by 3 by 14 inches and plugged into wall power, just to make a beam only slightly more powerful than a standard laser pointer today. The only thing it could do that would still be impressive today was that it had a headphone jack, and if you pointed it at a solid object like a wall, you could hear conversations happening near that spot. Story 129. I will never forget Mario jumping out of that pipe and being able to run around a three-dimensional environment. The jump from the Super Nintendo Entertainment System to the Nintendo 64 was unlike anything else. Story 130. When I was in Boy Scouts about 20 years ago, we went to an Air Force base for an overnight stay. They gave us a tour of the base and took us to a hangar with a plane that had a laser on the nose cone. The airman giving the tour said that at that moment there were about 10 to 12 of those same planes that could circle the United States and be used for air-to-air missile defense. I wish I could remember more about the trip and the discussion, but the story of the airman talking about shooting lasers at missiles has never left my mind. Story 131. My dad's business partner got us an Atari 2600 for Christmas in 1977. I was pretty awestruck as a 5-year-old. Our house didn't see another console until the Nintendo Entertainment System. Story 132. The first modern smartphone was the iPhone. I know it was not that long ago, but it blew my mind when I first used one. Story 133. My cousin moved to Silicon Valley in the mid-1990s. One Christmas, he brought home a virtual reality headset he had been working on. It had a roller coaster simulator that absolutely blew my mind. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.